All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Leveling Up. I'm Sarithkin from Ontier, and I have Taran, who is also from Ontier from the Summits. She is a seamstress in real life, professionally, and she's also on one of the longest vigils ever to be a Laurel in Ontier. So congratulations on that.
Thanks. Assuming we have a September crown, that's when the thing will be happening. So,
well, I'm very excited for you. I told you this already, but I'll admit it publicly as well. I've sort of gone down this German rabbit hole, and you have the most amazing stuff online. Like, not only do you make amazing stuff, but you are so free with sharing your knowledge and making it accessible for other people that it's just wonderful. And I just want to thank you publicly for that. It's amazing.
when I first started, I entirely relied on the information I could find online shared by others to get my start in my first few pieces of garb, and still honestly to this day to do research in things that I'm not very familiar with. And I feel like it's my moral obligation as someone who has looked to what others have shared online to share what I can, especially being pretty far away from a lot of the people who are interested in the same thing I am. I don't get to do a lot of in-person teaching, so I try to be as available online as I can be.
Well, it is much appreciated, and I am so thrilled that you agreed to come on this and teach a little bit about soft kits, because you have the most amazing soft kits on the planet. So I'm just going to let you take it away, unless you have anything else, that you want from me.
No, I'm hoping that there'll be questions and stuff after this, because I am mostly focusing on all the weird pattern stuff that I have learned how to do through both my work mundanely and through just being a fighter who has to wear clothes and being a total fit snob, which I totally admit that I am. So I have this whole presentation here so I don't get sidetracked and forget what to say.
Excellent.
So why are we not? Okay. So some general stuff that it is always worth mentioning if you're doing pattern stuff is you really always want to check and make sure that your armscye, which is the armhole, it's just a weird word for that spell check hates, your armscye, your neckline, and the bucket, which is the seat part of your pants, the little U shape of negative space that your butt goes in. Make sure before and after you true your pattern that those are big enough for your body. If your neck hole is only this wide and your neck is not, you know you have a problem before you even cut into fabric. Same thing, your armhole and your rise seam should also be the size that it looks like your body will fit in. And that's one of those things that seems obvious, but if you're teaching yourself, sometimes it's one of those why didn't I think of that moments, but always a good place to start with.
Could I ask you a question? Because one of the things that I think a lot of fighters struggle with is ripping out their pants. And how do you tell if your bucket is big enough or your armscye is big enough?
I have a section to go over that in here.
Cool.
I'm going to go over that a little bit later. But the big thing is, if you line up your side seam or your inseam or whichever part you're looking at, if you line up the two halves of it where the seams are touching, you should be able to put that over your armscye or stand with it between your legs, and there should be enough room just on your paper pattern to fit in there. And if there isn't, then there's a problem. But there's a couple of other nuances in there that I'm going to go over a little bit as well. There's so many cool things that I have learned at work. We have an awesome 3D fitting program that we use now that allows you to try something on a digital avatar, wow, make a tweak to it, and then hit go, and it will apply that change to the garment rendered on the avatar, so you can see instant gratification of, if I re-angle the shoulder seam, does it fix the problem or make it worse? And then you've got an undo button, and it's been a really marvelous learning tool. to fine tune even the knowledge that I have. And it's been an awesome training tool for my assistant at work, who is fairly new to patterning herself. She's got a lot of potential, but not a whole lot of schooling. And she has been picking things up really fast and doing a great job, because we're able to go into these fittings together from hundreds of miles away and be able to see together the exact same thing and make the pattern changes. So but yeah, there's so many cool things to know. So I'm going to go over a lot of this in a little bit more depth later. One of the other seems obvious, but you really want to make sure things is making sure all of your seams walk one-to-one without discrepancy. There's a couple of exceptions where that's okay if there's a little bit of a discrepancy, but in general, you want to make sure that your side seam for your front is the same as your side seam for your back. Otherwise, you're going to run into trouble. Padding is one of those things that I don't feel like there's enough information to figure it out online how to do this. My first gambeson, I spent weeks building this beautiful all linen gambeson with the quilting pattern lining up and just gorgeous. 9 months of fighting, I outgrew the thing. My shoulders and my forearms got too big and I could not move in it. And part of that is because trying to figure out how much to add to your pattern is really hard. I was told add 4 inches, and 4 inches seems like a lot. And 4 inches, like, is that 4 inches in width? Is that 4 inches in height? Is that 4 inches all the way around? No one really tells you how to do it. What you really want to do with padding, I've discovered, is in general, you want about 4 inches in any circumference. That's your arm circumference, your torso circumference, whatever circumference you're dealing with. You want to start with adding about 4 inches of that, but you also want to add about a half an inch in height. Another suggestion I would make is if you are doing a padded gambeson, one of the things that would be super helpful is if you have a fairly snug fitted, like, puffy jacket, put that on and take your measurements over that puffy jacket to give yourself just a little bit more peace of mind that you're getting close to the size, close to the measurements of your padded body, because that's a really big difference. One thing that the further away you get from, there's some numbers that are easier to math than other numbers, but in general, for every for every inch of diameter, your circumference is getting bigger. You take up about 3 more inches of circumference. You know, that it's geometry, which a lot of us did not pay attention to in school. But for every inch total thickness, that's, you know, if it's, you have half-inch padding, that's a half an inch on your front and a half an inch on your back, that's an inch in diameter. You're gaining 3 inches in circumference, and that's not accounting for the additional stiffness that the mobility is going to, that your mobility is going to need to be functional. So a good starting place is about 4 inches in circumference and about a half an inch in height. Padding is tricky. One thing that's super important that I cannot stress enough is, even if you hate sewing, mock-ups are always worth doing, because you can get relatively inexpensive mock-up fabric. And even if you're doing something like a gambeson where you do have that padding and you need to test it bigger, you can go down and get a moving blanket or an ugly bedspread from Goodwill or something relatively inexpensive to throw together a mock-up. Always worth it. For most things, I tend to use old bed sheets because they're inexpensive, they're easy to get, they're easy to draw on with Sharpies, they're easy to cut and pin, and they're pretty stable, and that's just kind of my standard. But I have made mock-ups out of a lot of other things when I needed a certain fabric characteristic as well. One thing that was like the biggest aha moment when I first started formally training as a pattern maker is that your seam intersections should always add up to 180 degrees unless you have reason for them not to. And it only has to be for like the half an inch before that seam intersection needs to happen. Then you can go to all the curves you want to have. But as you can see on the screen, like I did a little handy illustration. So if you have two rectangles, they sew together to make a flat line at the bottom. And if you have two, whatever the shape is, and they're slanty, but they match, and these two angles add up to 180 degrees, you get a nice smooth line. But if you're sewing together two triangles this way, you're gonna get a point. And if you're sewing together two angled seams this way, you're going to get this little valley, and that causes a lot of problems. And there are definitely exceptions to this. Things that like dropped V waistlines, like that very Venetian V that you get on the bodice, your seam obviously doesn't want to be a perfectly flat line because it is trying to make part of that V. Or seams that go into something really shaped, like the leather chest protector I have does not, and the seams do not go together in a perfect 180 because it needs to bulge out to actually have room for being a chest protector. Same is the case for the best pattern I found to make like an Indian choli to go with a sari, is there's a very angled seam in the front depending on how busty you are. And then there's things like skirt gores and rectangular construction where it's really okay if you have that extra thing. But when you're dealing with something more fitted, it's really important to keep that nice flat 90 degrees just for a half an inch on either side of the seam. It's super helpful. So one of the other cool things, I know this isn't a problem for everyone, but just about anyone who sews is going to at some point end up making for someone for whom the normal tie a string around the waist and have them wiggle side to side is not going to find your waistline. And there's so many critical measurements, especially when you're dealing with different time periods that need things to end at or just slightly below the natural waist, that you need that stable reference point. And where do you put it on someone who's kind of round? Or even some of the people who just are very short-waisted or really stocky and they just don't, the waist string does not settle at the waist. There's a lot of different body shapes and a lot of different muscle proportions that this just doesn't work for. So one handy trick for that is you can use a person's arms to get that reference point that is going to be something stable on their body, and just have them stand with their arms out at 90-degree angles and their shoulders relaxed, and just put the waist string at the level where the bottom of their elbow is. And it may not be perfect at their waist, but it's a stable reference point you can use for taking all of your measurements and looking at things in fittings later. Some people have longer arms, some people have shorter, but if you know that, you can also be like, okay, this person has really ridiculously long monkey arms. We're going to put the string an inch above where their elbow is. Or this person has real short T-Rex arms. We're going to put the string a little bit lower. But it's a good stable reference point that is sometimes really critical on someone that you cannot take a normal waist measurement on. Hip measurements are something that those of us who are a bit curvier I have been taking hip measurements wrong for 20 years before I figured this one out. Super easy, super brilliant. It's especially handy if you're doing something like a coat hardy or anything that is supposed to be fitted across the torso, fitted down to the like lower hip area and then flare out or even stay tight at that area. Anything that is fitted from your waist to your hips. If you take your hip measurement the way we've all been taught to take your hip measurement, you are going to end up with your side seam pulling toward the back and accenting that little bit of pooch that most of us have right at the front of our waistlines. Anatomy people, it exists. It's a problem for everybody, but you can de-emphasize this area with a simple measuring trick, which is putting a ruler under a string tied around your waist and measuring over that ruler. It's going to add like for me, it adds like 3 or 4 inches to my hip circumference when I measure that way. But what that does is it allows the garment to fall down from the largest point in front with a little bit of space at the hip level in front, instead of pulling toward the back and creating these terrible drag lines and emphasizing my stomach, and also being tight in the hips if I end up moving around and lunging. Super easy, super helpful. Next thing is balance is one of those really hard concepts to try and explain to people. That is one of those, if you have a very visual brain, you can kind of envision it. The way I try to explain balancing patterns is you don't want any of your pattern pieces to lean more than your body does in a certain direction. And I've really exaggerated it on the illustration that I did here, where if you draw a nice perpendicular line up from the center hem here, the entire front torso is above that on this first piece. And your body does not lean that far when you're standing at a neutral stance. You really want it to look more like this. And in order to balance that pattern, though, if you've drafted your pattern so you have the right hip measurement and the right waist measurement and the right bust measurement, you don't want to lose any of that. So I try to explain it like, envision you have a stack of books and you're just straightening those books. None of those books are getting bigger. None of those books are getting smaller. They're just straightening so you have that center line running through your pattern piece. And you can do this for sleeves, you can do it for pants, you can do it for anything. I tend to use a basic short coat hardy pattern as my like default because it's simple, they look good on everyone, and they're super challenging to fit well because bodies are very uniquely shaped. Next thing is fitting tip. Always start at the top of the garment because everything is going to hang from that top point. So if you're fitting a torso garment or a dress, you want to start with the top of the shoulder, right where it meets the neck. And then you want to go down to the shoulder point, and then you fit everything lower from there. Because sometimes you can fix a whole lot of problems just by re-angling your shoulder seam, and suddenly the rest of it looks great. Same thing with pants. You want to make sure that the waistband is sitting where the waistband needs to be and that everything looks good there. And sometimes that will fix some of the other problems below it. Another thing that I would highly recommend is people get over ambitious with mock-ups and we're like, I'm going to mock up my entire pattern. And I don't do that. I start with the most critical pieces. If I am doing a doublet or a coat hardy or something that's my torso, it is just the front pieces and the back piece, and that's it. I don't do collars, I don't do sleeves, I don't do facings, I don't do pockets, nothing else until I've perfected that first torso encasing part of it. Because most of those things are going to be changed by how you're shaping the pieces in your fitting. So I almost always do 2 mock-ups of everything. If the first mock-up turns out great, if I just do my torso pieces and it turns out great and all I have to do is do a little bit of armhole shaping or just like pin the shoulder seam out, then I'll cut out sleeves and add the sleeves to my original mock-up. But sometimes it's weird enough, I gotta keep going. So that's one thing that I would recommend is don't get too into making your mock-ups from the get-go look too much like your original, like a planned finished garment. You want them to be flexible, adaptable, expendable, and fast to throw together. Old mock-ups make excellent pillow stuffing, by the way. What else are you gonna do with all of that fabric? I have waterproof fabric and I make pillows to sit on in my garden. It works really well. The dogs have taken them all over, so I don't get to sit in them, but the dogs appreciate it, so I guess it's still good. Pants. There's some stuff about pants. I promised we'd get to this. So some general rules for pants, and I've been trying to keep my language a lot more gender neutral in this than a lot of the patterning books you can find. It's really hard when patterning has been taught for centuries as a very gendered thing to try and neutralify the language while still talking about the anatomical differences that on average are experienced by people. But so my general tips one thing to remember is your pants typically should be wider in the back than they are in the front, and not by a huge degree. It's like 3/5 of it is the back and 2/5 of it is the front. And this is not by any means a like hard rule. It depends on how curvy you are and it depends on the style of pants. But in general, your back piece should be a little wider than your front piece. And especially where this width comes in is if you draw a line straight down from your waist on the front and straight down from your waist on the back, you want to start with at least about 2/3 of this bucket depth should be in the back and only about 1/3 of it in the front. Another thing that's really important, especially if you're curvy, I know I talk about that a lot, but I learned to be a pattern maker because I'm curvy enough that most clothes don't fit me right. My body proportion is weird. So I'm like the worst case scenario fit for at least someone close to my size because my proportions are just all over the board. But you always want to make sure that your pants are at least a little bit taller in the back than they are in the front. And if you're more streamlined, maybe that difference from center front to center back is only about 2 inches. For people who are real curvy, that can be 4 inches, it can be 6 inches, it can be more. Do what your body needs. You only, though, want to add that height to this upper section. Doesn't matter how curvy you are, you don't necessarily want to mess with anything below your hip level.
Can you explain what you mean by bucket width again? Somebody's asking.
Yes, this is the page about bucket width.
Oh, great.
So your bucket width, if you line up the inseam of your pants together like this, so this is your inseam, this is your outseam in the back, your outseam in the front, you have created this U shape. You've created this bucket, and your butt needs to fit in that bucket. So unless you're doing really, really fitted pants, your bucket is always going to be super wide at the top. That's not really the part we're concerned about. What we're concerned about is the bottom of this bucket. We are concerned about this area that's a couple of inches up from your inseam. And you want to make sure that if you tape your pattern piece together and step over it and hold it up, that at no point does this paper pattern get so tight that you cannot have this inseam point touch your body without putting strain here or here. Your butt needs to fit in that bucket. A good way to measure this, it's inconvenient to like tape your pattern together and step over it and hold it. Like that's a good way to check, but you don't have to do it that way. If you are trying to draft your pattern on paper, or you're working on a pattern for someone that is not present, you can measure this depth more or less by basically having the person that you are measuring stand against a wall with a rigid ruler between their legs and measure how deep their body is from the wall to where that ruler sticks out. And you want this area here to be that depth. One thing that's also important to know is that your front rise curve here, the apex of where it's super curvy should end up somewhere about halfway between where your full hip level is and where your crotch inseam level is. So this is kind of where you want to measure the bucket, is around where your full hip is. And if you notice above that, the rise is fairly straight in both the front and the back. It angles out, but it's fairly straight. But most of the curve happens from your full hip level down in this area. Your back rise is also going to be a lot smoother of a curve than your front rise, and there's reasons for that. We're going to keep going on pants for a while. There's a lot about pants are hard to fit. Like I avoided making pants for years when I first started patterning because they're so hard. This is a weird thing here that seems really counterintuitive, but it really does work. If you are making pants that need extra room in the front, whether that is extra room for groin protection or personal anatomy, whatever. One of the things that can help with that seems really counterintuitive, but carving the front of your rise out a little bit more, like this green line, and leaning the front of it a little bit further forward. And it doesn't really make sense, but if you take a piece of paper and you make it this shape and you cut it out, and then you take that paper and bend it so that this top waistline becomes parallel to the floor again, what you've done is you've created a bubble of space that happens right here where you need that extra pocket of space. You do have to make sure your hips are not too tight for this fix to work. Like you may need to add some extra ease into the side seam or into the back to make this work. But this shaping, which by the way is exaggerated for the illustration, you really don't want this area to be to carve in or this area to lean out more than about 3/8 of an inch. It's fairly subtle, but that shaping is going to create a bit of a bubble that is, you are going to see it on the finished garments. If I'm going to turn you all into weirdos like other pattern makers have admitted to being, you're going to be staring at people in at weddings or whatnot. If you see guys especially wearing dress slacks, if you look at the front of their pants right below this crotch level, you'll see that there is a flat spot that does not touch their legs that happens right at this front inseam of their pants. And that is a function of the shape of this rise leaning out like that. I actually know a pattern maker who will like sneak up behind people in grocery stores and take pictures of their butts as examples of how not to fit pants. It's hilarious. She got like a whole gallery of it. And like, I'm not recommending that anyone do that. It's creepy and weird. But once you start noticing some of these fit changes, you start seeing the fit problems everywhere. It does make you a bit of a weirdo. And I'm sorry for that if I've influencing anybody else to be analyzing men's pants at weddings. More pants stuff. So here's one of the coolest things about pants. At least one of the coolest things you could do to fix pants. So if you have noticed that your pants are making these drag lines like this, sure we've all seen this, or that anytime you sit or squat or crouch or whatever, that your pants are dipping down at the center back, or they're just really uncomfortably tight when you're lunging or when you're lifting your legs to climb stairs or whatever, and you know your bucket is the right width, you've already checked that. One of the things you can do to fix it is to take your pattern and draw a line right across from just below the full hip level up to where that curve starts. Just take that, cut it, and spread it apart about 1/2 inch and tape it back together. And what you've done when you do this is you've added a little bit of height to this back rise. So you're making it a little bit taller up here, but you're also pushing this part of it a little bit closer to the bias, which is really important when we're dealing with non-stretch fabrics. This is not a very commonly taught trick anymore because a lot of our pants today have some Lycra in them. There's not a whole lot of markets where people actually need to know this sort of stuff because as a modern garment industry, everyone relies so heavily on stretch fabrics. About the only places you find information on how to deal with stable woven fabrics, which we have in the SCA, is in the military market, which technically that's where my job is. I make military uniforms at work, and then I come home and make historic military clothing. But this fix can do an enormous amount of good. In general, our standard at work is if we make a pair of pants and we measure from where your waist is to where your waistband is, and then we measure that same distance after you've sat down in a chair, if there's more than 1 inch of difference, if your pants drop more than 1 inch, we keep going, we keep working on them, we keep refitting them until there's only an inch of drop. That is our cutoff. And I would wager that nearly everyone here has at least one pair of pants that they bought off the rack at the store that will drop at least 3 or 4 inches because they're not fitted to your body. And in a lot of cases, for fabric efficiency, I totally do get it. They're not angled as steeply out. And this outseam that I have drawn here is not, this looks fairly normal. If you're curvy, you may end up with your outseam bulging out a lot in back and looking really weird and not normal. And believe me, it looks real strange, but it is okay. You will get a better fit from it. A lot of the stuff does not seem intuitive, which is why it's worth teaching in a class. But I would caution that in general, you don't want to do this change in huge increments. You don't want to go, oh gosh, I did the sitting down and measuring and the standing up and measuring and the difference was 4 inches. You do not want to add 4 inches. 4 inches is too much. If it's really bad, maybe add an inch. But in general, we do half-inch increments when we're fixing stuff at work because in general, 1/2 inch to 3/4 is all you're going to need for most things. Especially if you're working from an already created like commercial pattern and you're just trying to fit it to you, it shouldn't be too far off. 1/2 inch sometimes can make a world of difference. You never want to go so far that the flat part of your back rise seam is more than a bias. Like you don't want it to go past that 45-degree angle. That's too much. If you have to go that far, then there's something else wrong that you need to address.
So someone's asking, they're saying, doing Venetians, how much waist hip ease do we add?
Like the Venetian hose.
I think that must be what they're talking about.
I've made 2 pairs of those. One of them was absolutely adored straight out of the book where I got the pattern cutting layout. Person who got them loves them, wore them a lot. I'm actually wearing a doublet made out of the scraps of the fighting kit I made for him that includes those pants. But the other one I made, he wore them once and hated them because they didn't have enough height in the back rise. Every time he bent, squatted, sat, lunged, the pants started falling down in the back and he hated them. He barely wore them. I honestly don't trust any of the cutting layouts I've seen. They are all way too shallow in the back. I honestly would go, I would take the normal cutting layout that I've seen and I would add at least 3 inches up here. And then I would come over and probably lean this out a little bit, like maybe up to an inch. The ones that I've seen have just been so poorly shaped to fit on an actual human body. They need a lot of help, especially in this area. I honestly really am curious what the shape of the person whose pants they took that cutting layout off of was. Like, I want to see what this guy looked like. Was he some sort of like skeleton person with absolutely no butt? I wonder, because those pants don't look like they fit a human. Hopefully that answers the question. So here's a big thing that if you're making clothes for people who are used to the way men's pants usually fit, you might get in an argument over, just like the natural waist thing, which I'm not even getting into in this. If the crotch area of your pants is too low, it is going to impede your motion. The biggest reason people have crotch blowouts is because their rise is too low. It makes your pants twist, it puts strain on that inseam, it can cause your crotch to blow out, it makes it uncomfortable, it restricts the motion when you're lifting your legs up. It's really important that you have your pants rise sitting close-ish to your body if you want decent movement. If you are testing out your mock-up and you think your pant rise is too low, easiest way to fix that is to hike them up until the rise feels like it's sitting in a comfortable place. Test your movement, make sure that it's improving your mobility. And then at that point, just roll the waistband down on your mock-up until you got it where you want it to sit, and chalk that new waistline, and make sure before you take off the mock-up that you look down without bending, obviously, so you're not adjusting the length of your pants, but look down and make sure that you did not just make yourself high waters that you're going to be unhappy with later. Because if you're taking 2 inches off the top of your waist to raise that crotch up, you're taking 2 inches out of your overall length, and that might make your pants way shorter than you want them to be. So never forget to check your length, even if that's not the problem when you started. So pants gussets. I hear this a lot from people who are like, I'm not a pattern maker, but if I don't have a gusset in my pants, they don't work. Do your pants need a gusset? Yes, they can relieve strain on your rise and your inseam. They can also be a really great way to reduce rubbing and wear of seams at your inseam. And if you don't have room in your pants and you don't have more fabric, you don't want to remake them, adding a gusset in is a good solve. If you're a little bit shy on fabric and you just can't quite get the full width of your pants out, it is fine to do the rise section as a gusset. Totally legitimate. But you do not need to have a gusset to have good mobility in your pants. It is not a requirement. In general, it really, I think, depends on what style you're going for, whether or not you need to have one. I also am not a big fan of diamond gussets unless you're doing something looser. Like rectangular constructed diamond gussets, great, love them. If you're doing like more fitted pants, like if you are making like 14th century hose, if you're making 16th century hose, you don't want a diamond gusset. That point is only going to get in your way. I tend to make my gussets more like an eye shape. So they're rounded at the front and rounded at the back. They set in a lot more easily if you're doing a really fitted close to body garment. That just seems to make it smoother and a little easier to sew in general. And if you are doing something that fitted, I would caution you that gusset width from front to back really shouldn't be more than about 4, maybe 5 inches tops. Again, if you're doing looser fitted things, you can get away with bigger. But if you're doing something really, really fitted, any gusset that's bigger than about 5 inches, unless you're patterning for someone who is quite large, you are going to see too much of that gusset and it's going to create some weird shaping. In general, I tend to do my gussets for anyone who's in the like small, medium, large, extra large range. I tend to do the gussets about 3.5 to 4 inches wide at the widest center front to back point, and around 12 to 16 inches long is kind of the standard size I use for gussets. There are obviously exceptions to everything I'm saying here, but that's a good guideline if you don't know where to start. Okay, now we're moving on to tops. Does anyone have pants questions before I move on to upper bodies?
I'm not seeing any.
Cool. Upper bodies. So, anyone who has been in my sewing room knows that I loathe your standard T-tunic with a passion. The throw a T-shirt on a piece of fabric and cut it out and sew up the side seams and cut a neck hole and you're done. I hate them. Your pattern should be different front to back. There are T-shaped period tunics where they put the neckline where it's lower in the front like it should be and higher in the back like it should be. And it does not fit real people if you make it exactly the same front and back. And that's like the one thing, like if you want to make a T-tunic, you are on your own. It is the one thing I will not help you make. I will help you make any style period tunic you want, but I am not helping you make that. It is the one thing I will never help someone with because I hate them. That said, there are a couple of things that just in general should be different front to back on tops. That's good to know. You always want your back neck seam to be shallower, usually 1 inch to 1.5 inches deep from this high point shoulder down. whereas the front is going to be 4 to 6 inches on most people. It really, for a fitted high neckline, in any case. It's always good to start something off with the high neckline and then draw the neckline you want on your mock-up after. It's just easier. If you have more fabric, it's always easier to cut it away. So you want that discrepancy to be a good 3 inches at least from front to back. And it depends on the size of the individual, how big exactly that should be. Next thing is you want your back shoulder seam to be a lot flatter than your front shoulder slope. Your front shoulder slope should dip down quite a bit more than it does in the back. You also can make this back shoulder seam. This is one of the few exceptions to the it's totally legit to make one seam longer than the other. If your back shoulder seam is a 1/2 inch longer than your front shoulder seam, that's great. Stretch this a little, push that a little, ease it in to this seam. Don't gather it, don't pucker it, don't put tucks in it. Just ease them together, which is why you don't want to go more than 1/2 inch. And that is going to give you a little bit more space in your back shoulders, which you need to be able to move. You don't need that extra space in your front shoulders. The next thing is your back armscye needs to be a lot more filled in than your front armscye. Your front armscye needs to, if it is too wide, it's going to cut in when you move forward. And if your back armscye is too shallow, it's going to restrict when you start moving your arm forward. So you really want a decent difference between this. You want it in a normal, I'm not fighting in this, I'm just trying to make something that looks pretty. You want about 1/4 inch difference. For fighting garb, I tend to exaggerate that quite a bit more. You use your front as the stable point. There's really only so far you can move over the front armscye, but I tend to add more like 1/2 inch to the back shoulder, right at this lower armscye level, just because that is the most frequent restricted point on a lot of garments. Next thing is the overall width of your pattern. Seems weird, but it really should be a little bit wider in the front than it is in the back. And if you look at someone from the side, they're just standing completely normal profile, and you look at where the center line in their body is, the chest, the rib cage sits further to the front than it does to the back. So that little bit of extra width is going to help go over the round part of your chest, and whether you have an ample bosom or not, you're going to have just a little bit more rounded front than you are in the back. Your back is relatively flat. So a little bit more space in the front than the back. Varies by individual, at least 1/4 if you're fairly streamlined, and if you're curvier, it can be a 1/2 inch, sometimes more. Next thing is
Go back for just a second. Somebody wants to know if it's a 90-degree angle for the BC junction.
Yes. Yes, it should always be a 90-degree angle, but only for like the top 1/2 inch of this part and the top 1/2 inch of this part. And same here. You want that to be a nice smooth transition, regardless of what you're doing. Because it will curve out from there. Usually, depending on if your shoulders are really extended, sometimes it's only that 1/2 inch and it curves out from there. If you are doing the fairly inset ends where a bra strap would go level, sometimes it can be 4 or 5 inches, so they're nice and straight and come out at a 90-degree angle. But you always want at least that little bit there. So if you're dealing with curvy fitted garments, one of the biggest things that seems really weird and looks really, really strange is the difference in a garment that is fitted to go over my bosom and that of one of my male household members, our armhole is a very different shape. Mine is much more of a C shape, and theirs is a lot more of a J shape. And the reason for that is anyone who has an ample bosom, who has worn a tank top, has had that gap where you can see your bra through the side of the tank top, or if you're wearing a t-shirt, you've got those folds that are just sitting there. What you're doing with this is you are shortening the front of your armscye to take that up a little bit, and you are lengthening your center front seam to give just a little bit more give over the bosom. Having your front seam curve slightly is totally valid. It was done in a lot of period patterns. It's done in a lot of modern patterns still today. It's not a big difference. It's like the difference here, maybe 3/8 of an inch. Just a little 3/8 of an inch bigger here, 3/8 of an inch smaller here. If you're bustier, you may have to go bigger with that difference, but it doesn't have to be a big difference to make a really big impact on how things fit. Obviously, the exaggerated waist curves here, not mandatory, even if you are doing the fit changes of adding a little bit of curve up here and angling this armscye. But this is kind of the general difference if you're going from like unisex fit, which is BS because it does not fit people with boobs, to a more feminine garment. This is kind of what the pattern shapes would look like overlaid for someone who's the same size. That bust shaping, if you're really confused and worried about it, here's the super basic, easy way of doing it. You just kind of take where that fold starts here, and you take where your bust apex is, and you draw a line, and you cut it, and you take that fold out here, and you add a little bit of space in here, and then you smooth those curves out, and you're done. It's a super quick, easy pattern change that makes a world of difference if you're dealing with an ample bosom, especially if you are dealing with an ample bosom that is covered in a rigid material to make it not squishy. Finding garb is challenging, guys. Okay. This is back to the same basic thing that we were talking about with your bucket width. Your arm should fit in this hole. Your arm needs to fit through your armhole. If you can't tape your pattern together and stick your arm through it all the way up to your armpit, your armscye is not wide enough. This is one of the hardest things for me to learn when I taught myself how to make patterns when I was a kid, and I made almost everything I wore my senior year of high school, and almost everything was super tight in the armhole because it had not yet clicked for me that the width here needed to be the same as the width of my arm. And luckily I was really skinny, especially in the arms at the time, so it worked. I was able to wear it. But yeah, you really want to make sure that this width here at the bottom of your armscye is big enough for your arm to fit in here. Do not even bother patterning your sleeves until you make sure this fits, because you really want your sleeves to match this curve. And again, you see the overlay of the curvy fitted garment and the generic, more masculine fit garment here, so you can see what the difference looks like, but both of them, you still want this space there. So the height of your armscye, just kind of like the height of the rise in your pants, is going to make a huge difference in how effectively you can move your arm. If you make your armscye too high, it's going to be really uncomfortable. And if you make it too low, your big baggy sleeves are going to restrict your arm movement. You're not going to be able to fit it. But a lot of people know that, but they're like, but how do you know how high is too high? How low is too low? Especially if you're fitting a mock-up with no sleeves on it. Like, weirdest trick in the world. If you're making something super fitted, have the person you're fitting, whether that's you or not, stick one finger all the way up in their armpit and close their arm. That's how low their armpit needs to be for a super fitted garment. If you're making a bust supportive coat hardy that's locked into your torso, one of your fingers under your arm, that's it. If you are making something a little roomier, doublet, looser garment, 2 fingers under your armpit. That's how high your armpit needs to be. That's it. Super easy trick. You want to have the person you're fitting use their fingers because it works better with the proportions of their body. Like if you're the same size, then I guess it doesn't matter. But if you're like, if you're 5'1" and wear an extra small and you're fitting someone who's 300 pounds, your fingers are going to be different size. Your arm size is going to need a different amount of ease. But in general, the 1 or 2 finger widths has been pretty good to me for the last decade or so. I've been measuring arm size this way, and it has worked on almost everyone. It's at least a really good starting point. Even if it's not perfect, it's at least an educated guess that'll get you most of the way there. Here is the really weird bit. Sleeves are another thing that are super challenging because you got to be able to move in them. They're weird. But the height of your sleeve cap has a huge amount to do with how mobile your arm is. Like if you've ever worn a t-shirt and a suit jacket, you know how differently those 2 garments fit. Your sleeve cap on your t-shirt is super, super shallow. Sometimes the curve is almost non-existent. It's almost like a rectangular tunic, the way that fits. And the sleeve of your suit jacket has this really tall cap. It's not quite to the level of the Victorian poofs, but really close. And so if you move your arms out with your t-shirt, your arm can go straight out, not a problem, looks great, fits fine, feels comfy. You try that in a suit jacket and you get about to here and it's pushing at your bicep and it's pulling across your torso and it's lifting the whole garment and there's drag lines and it's ugly and there's strain under your armpit. It's all sorts of bad. So then why don't we just make everything with your flat shoulder seam and call it good? Because when you have your arms at rest, you have kind of the opposite problem. Your shallow sleeve cap, your t-shirt has wrinkles and drag lines and extra bulk in your armpit. And especially if you're dealing with a padded garment, that's a lot of bulk in your armpit. And it doesn't look good and it's chunky and it doesn't feel good. And who wants extra bulk in the place where you're sweating? It's no good. And your suit jacket looks great. Totally comfortable at rest. It's relaxed, it's smooth, there's no extra bulk there. So clearly we need a middle ground. We can't fight if we can't lift our arms, and we don't want huge chunks of fabric in our underarms. So how do you find the middle ground? How do you find what works for you? I'm very proud of this. This is the illustration that I'm most proud of in this entire presentation because I've not seen it written out anywhere else where it makes sense. So your sleeve cap angle, if you draw a line from your underarm point to your sleeve cap point, and you look at the angle of that, that's about how high you can expect to be able to lift your arm without restriction. So if you're doing your rectangular constructed tunic, your angle is flat, you can go straight out, fine. If you're doing a 45-degree angle, you've got that really steep sleeve cap, you get to about 45 before your arm is restricted. So I can't tell you what the ideal angle is because that is going to vary based on your priority. What is most important to you? Do you want it to look great at rest? Do you want it to look okay with a little bit of restriction? Is mobility the only thing that matters to you? It's really up to you. And it's not to say that if you go with this 75-degree angle, it's not to say that you can't move your arm past about 75 degrees. It's just that is when you're going to start noticing that it is lifting your torso garment up with your arm movement. That's when it's going to start moving things. And if you've got, I know some people have knee armor that's anchored to their torso armor. So you've got to bear that in mind. If you have your knees pointed to your gambeson and you only went with the 60 degree because you want it to look great when you're standing still, you are going to be restricted with that because your garment can't lift up to give you that extra reach that you need. So every person is going to have to decide for themselves where they want to be. But with this chart, you kind of have a better sense of looking at your pattern, being able to predict how restrictive it's going to be. So you can make that choice for yourself, but at least it can be sort of an educated guess. So, oh gosh, sleeves are complicated. I apologize if this is sideways. So this again is a sleeve cap folded in half. So this is your center line that goes down your sleeve, and here's your sleeve underarm seam. And your green line here is what I usually do for my fighting garb. And the pink is what the back of a normal sleeve looks like. And the black is what the front of your sleeve should look like. So when you're patterning the sleeve cap shape, in general, if you draw a line here and a line here and a line perfectly in the middle, divide this up into these 8 little boxes here, your center point should intersect with your front sleeve, more or less. And your front sleeve in this quadrant here should be carved in at least 1/4 inch more than the back on normal sleeves. And if you notice, most of the difference between the front of your sleeve and the back of a normal sleeve, most of that difference is in this B quadrant, and it kind of blends a little in the A and a little in the C, but it's mostly here. With fighting garb, I have real broad shoulders, and I don't like to be restricted by my clothes. I make this a much bigger difference with fighting garb. Instead of having the peak of the difference be down here in the middle of this B quadrant, I put the middle of that closer to the BC intersection line, and I have it go across all 3 of these boxes. I have it stable. Again, you want that 90-degree angle right up here for at least 1/2 inch. And same thing goes for anywhere you're going to fold and want a nice straight line. You want a 90-degree angle here. But after that, I add a bunch to the back of my sleeves. I usually make the back of my sleeves about 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch taller than I do in the front when I'm making fighting garb, because I don't like that restriction. This is another area where you can have a discrepancy between your seams. It is totally okay for even on nice, smooth, sewn together, no gathers sleeves, you can have your sleeve be 1/2 inch longer than your arm's eye circumference and ease that in mostly across the top. Also, if you're doing anything with gathers or slashes or embellishments or whatever, dividing your sleeve cap up this way is a really good way to tell where you want to do that. Because basically your A and your B quadrants are mostly under your arm. That is mostly where you cannot see them when your arms are at rest. Your B to C intersection line is what separates the outside of your sleeve from the inside of your sleeve. So all of your slashing, all of your gathers, all of your everything that's going to be fancy and pretty and visible outside and not creating bulk in your armpit needs to be in this half. Balancing sleeves is super important, and there's a couple different ways you can test this. One of them is folding it like I did in the last slide, but one of them is also, now that you have that nice fold line that goes down the center, you unfold it and then fold both sides in to match that center line. You should have a nice pretty 90-degree angle where everything lines up here and a nice pretty 90 where it lines up here. And you should be able to make this fold, this crease, and have this all line up. If you try to fold it like this and you end up with it sitting like that, it means your sleeve is slightly off balance and you need to do that tilting, leaning, stack of books thing to get it to work. Another thing that's super cool is the amount that you carve in for your front underarm and the amount that you add to your back shoulder for fighting garb make these kitty corner sections similar. Whereas your I didn't mess with it back underarm and your normal front sleeve cap are kind of matchy with the quadrant that's kitty corner across from them. Um, if your sleeves do end up staggered and offset, like they're not lining up when you fold them this way, what that's going to do is it's going to create weird folds and twists, and that's going to be forcing your sleeve into a twist while it's on your body if you make that match up, which can be really uncomfortable. And if you're using it to anchor your armor to it, it's basically going to create armor creep, which no one needs. So articulated seams are something that I super love. All of my coworkers kind of make fun of me because every time we have an opportunity to work in articulation, I'm all about it. Articulated seams go back to at least the 14th century, probably earlier, but we don't have proof of that. But this is one of the earliest garments we do have that has articulated seams. Notice how these sleeves are kind of bent, even though there's not, I mean, there's a mannequin arm in them, but it is not forcing them into that bend. You can see how smooth they are at this gradual bend. Articulation is really, really cool. It's important if range of motion is really critical and you need something to be a snug fit, like if you're wearing it under armor, and if you want to avoid chafing an extra bulk. So articulation is really cool because it shapes seams to follow the way your body bends. And it makes it not just a better fit at rest, like that mannequin wearing that garment, but it also is a better fit for the motions you can expect your body to do. And it makes a much visually cleaner garment because you don't have that unnecessary, that uncomfortable bulk that's wrinkling and bunching at the front of your arm's eye or the front of your elbow. And you're adding ease to the back of your elbow where you really need that reach when you're swinging. So if you don't have that ease, it's tight, it's restrictive, but it's also potentially going to cause some premature failure as you're getting this additional stress here at the back of your sleeve. And you can address the same thing with pleats or darts being added strategically, but both of those are a lot more work. And they're also potential fail points that add more bulk than an articulated seam. So also, articulated seams still in use today in suit jackets. Again, look at that little bend to the sleeve. It's a different format of articulation than what you usually see in history, but it is still an articulated seam that is bent to the front. And this is another one of those things that you don't really have a lot of demand for learning now because we don't use the sort of fabrics that really, really need this technique. So articulation is super easy. Here's again my sideways sleeve. I'm sorry about that. The program I use at work does everything sideways, so my brain kind of works both directions, and I kind of forget until I'm trying to explain to other people that that's not normal. So here's a sleeve pattern, normal sleeve, and we've got these fold lines because we tested to make sure it was balanced. And all we're going to do is we're going to figure out where our elbow is and draw a line, and then make an S and a different S, and trace this out on different pieces of paper, because when we cut it out, what we're going to do is we're going to use this pink line to make the lower sleeve. We're going to use this blue line to make the upper sleeve. So what we've done is we've just cut out 1.5 inches of the front of the elbow and added 1.5 inches to the back of the elbow and changed the angle that sleeve is going to sit at, which super really easy concept, but it's a little weird to do. It's one of the things I should mention also is that you don't have to do this articulation line right over the point of your elbow, because obviously you have a seam where your elbow is now. If you're wearing elbow cups over this, that can get super uncomfortable. You probably want to offset, but you can take this line, if your elbow is here, you can draw that line up to 3 inches if you need to, and do your articulated seam a little bit higher. It's totally legitimate. And I've drawn this on like a normal modern sleeve that isn't split up the way some of these other sleeves might be. if you are doing something that has hanging sleeves or looks like it could have hanging sleeves, this front line is about where you would split your sleeve to have that opening for your arm to come out if it was a hanging sleeve. If you're doing like a coat hardy that has buttons or lacing up the back of your arm, that's pretty much where your back fold line is. And you can do the same articulation in sleeves that are broken up differently than this one. That's totally fine. I just like to show it on this one because it's the easiest, smoothest to understand line, where it's like we are taking the most out at this front line, adding the most in at this back line, but it is a relatively symmetrical S shape that we've created here. So what you end up with is this. Just a little shorter in the front on both the top and the bottom, and a little longer in the back on the top and the bottom. You'll want to add match notches and make sure that it walks and everything, but that's really basically all there is to making sleeves that are going to give you 1.5 inches more length when you bend your arm than anything with a straight pattern. It also can be a little more fabric efficient because you can nest these things in there better than your big sleeve piece. And you can do, apparently I just have a comparison here. So this is the extant garment that you saw on this previous slide. Here's what that pattern looks like. And it's broken up in a different way. You can see where we've got the back of the sleeve with these buttonholes and these buttons, and the front of the sleeve is kind of in the center. But you can see that the front of the sleeve, top and bottom, is lower, and the back of the sleeve, bottom and top, is a little bit higher. And here's the sleeve that we made. You can break it up in a bunch of different ways, but the basic thing is you want to add a little to the back, take a little away from the front. Super, super easy thing to do once you've seen it in practice. If you do have an undersleeve, like a lot of modern suit jackets have undersleeves, or you have a gusset or something, you do also need to include some of that bend to your gusset or undersleeve, which doesn't have to be a sharp line. You can make it a nice smooth arc. But you can add that in to the elbow, which is what we did on the sleeve piece. Or if you want, you can add a little to the elbow and a little to the shoulder to make this gusset lean forward in both places, because you need mobility in both places. It's totally legitimate to split it up however you want between the two. You definitely still want some at the elbow, but if you want to put a little in the shoulder too, that's fine. You can do the same thing with pants. If you have a low stance, you do a lot of lunging or whatever, you need more mobility in your pants. You need to be able to kneel. You can do the same thing to your pants. You figure out where your knee is, offset a little bit if you want. Usually it's better to go higher than lower. So if you wanted this off your knee, you'd bump it up a couple inches, but you don't have to worry about finding those sidelines because your outseam and your inseam are your sidelines. You just draw that curve up and curve down and curve up and curve down, and you make the front a little longer and the back a little shorter, and that takes that bulk out of the back of your knee and gives you a little bit more reach in the front of your knee. Again, if you are wearing armor over this, probably a good idea to offset it off of the bone just a little bit, but easy enough to do. And okay. Any other questions on seam articulation before I move into the other miscellaneous?
I don't see any questions, just lots of, this is fantastic.
Yay. Okay, so other things that are important to discuss. How not to trip over your dress. I usually fight in what is technically men's garments, but look feminine to a modern eye. But I do also occasionally, for fancy tournaments, fight in the ridiculous orange dress that y'all probably saw. Skirt length is super important. You can fight in a floor length dress. It's a little bit harder. If you don't want to have risk of tripping over your skirt and you don't mind it being a smidge shorter, I highly recommend you taking your waist to floor measurement in front while lunging over your front knee. You'll end up with a high-low hem but it will keep it a lot more out of your feet. If you don't want to do that, if it is very important that you have that full floor length dress aesthetic, like my orange dress, because I was stubborn and insisted that it needed to look like a court dress. Roping the bottom of your hem is super helpful. You just make a facing for your skirt and you stick a piece of rope in there and you stitch it as tight as you can with that facing, so you have that nice firm thickness to it that helps the skirt sit out away from your body. You can do a hoop skirt. I have never done a hoop skirt. I know people who fight in them and love them, absolutely adore doing their hoop skirt thing, but there's a learning curve to that. And I also am really bad at, my depth perception's real bad, and I run into stuff enough as is. I do not need a skirt that's bigger than I am that doesn't want to squish between tables. I've never gone there. It is an option. I am not as informed on that. I cannot be as helpful. Petticoats are also an option, but that's going to add heat retention. One of the greatest things about fighting in a dress is you can just lift your skirt up and kind of fan your legs, get a nice breeze. You can't do that as effectively when you've got a petticoat that you're having to deal with. So the big ones for me that I have used has been slightly shorter in front skirt hems and roping the hem, both of which work. Dressing and undressing. So that delightful orange dress, in addition to not being long enough in the back shoulders, because I didn't do the seam articulation thing, it was before I learned how to do that I made that. It's really hard to get out of that dress, especially after I fought in it. I got in and out of it no problem when I made it. When I tried it on, I'm like, this is great. When I sweat in it, I get sticky and I can't get it off. I need help. It's really pathetic. I have to have someone hold onto the sleeves. I crawl out of it backwards like a derpy butterfly. It was a bad plan. I still haven't quite figured out how to fight in a Saxon gown and make it not a disaster to try and escape from. So closures are super important to figure out. For me, I like to be able to do things myself. I am not used to having someone to dress me and undress me. I don't like to have to rely on someone, especially after I've been fighting. Sometimes I just want out of my armor. It's sweaty and it's gross and I feel nasty and I just want it off. So closures are really important. Lacing takes a long time, especially if you have it in a place you can't see it or reach it effectively. You also want to take into account the event that you have some sort of incident, like heat exhaustion or an injury or something where someone is going to want to help you get out of your kit. You never want to think of the worst, but I have seen people come off the field and basically just panic attack, heat exhaustion, injury, whatever. They just need out. And you don't want something that's going to be so cumbersome that someone can't help you if you are, for whatever reason, unable to do it yourself. My Saxon gown would be really, really hard for someone to help me out of. Just not that functional in that respect. I'm still working on trying to figure out how to make that one a little bit more functional. Another thing you got to keep in mind is what undergarments you're going to wear with it. Anything you add is going to, one more layer, it's a little bit more heat, but maybe it'll make it a little bit easier to get it off if you're sweaty and sticky and gross. You also want to think about, like, if you are wearing chest protection under your garb, how much that's going to add, and make sure that you account for that. Another thing is considering integrated armor. So for my Saxon gown, I made my chest protector out of tooled leather and my gorget out of tooled leather and painted them copper so they look like the garments from the portraits I based that dress off of. So it doesn't look at first glance like I'm wearing armor, which is really cool from an aesthetic perspective. It's really neat to have that, but it also sometimes brings up martial questions where the marshals are like, is that just a costume piece? If you're doing something where I plan eventually when I take the sleeves apart and redo them so I can move my elbows without tearing out the back of the sleeve, I intend to make integrated elbow cops that just fit under the slashing so you can't see them. They just live in the dress. You want to consider that while you're constructing the thing, but you also want to be prepared for marshals to be giving you a little extra attention during inspection, and make sure that that you have a good way to show a marshal that you are wearing legit legal armor. Especially if you are not well known in the area that you're fighting in. You know, I got a lot more questions when I first started fighting in my ridiculous German kit than I get anymore. Anymore when people are like, this person is asking questions about doing weird costume armor things, can you help them? Like, the marshals send people to me with questions. But when I first started fighting, they're like, are you allowed to fight in that? Like, is that really legal? Be prepared. I don't think anyone is doing it to be a jerk. Everyone wants to make sure that we're all safe. But be prepared if you have integrated your armor that you might get questions about it and may need to show people that it's legit. Fabric choices are super, super important. Durability, obviously, in a fighting kit is really critical. Washability, because no one wants to smell like fighter forever. No one wants their car to smell like fighter on the way home from the event. You want to be able to wash your kit at least occasionally. And again, integrated armor, depending on what you're making that out of, can chew through your fabric. You want to consider that as you're making fabric choices, especially when it comes to linings, interlinings, things where you are going to have those rigid pieces that are prone to chewing. You want to make sure that if you are integrating your armor, you have something stable to anchor it to, and also a way to get it out for washing. And then my favorite, I like hats. I'm a big fan of hats. I made the first one as kind of a challenge, honestly. I was working on my very first Waffenrock at our local moot, and our local Laurel at the time was like, oh, is that a Waffenrock? And I'm like, yes, it is. And I'm like, I'm gonna wear it to fight at 11th night. And she's like, you're not gonna get that done in time. That's on Saturday. I'm like, yes. She's like, it's Thursday. I'm like, yes. She's like, you're not gonna get that done in time. I'm like, yes, I am. So I went home, and not only did I finish it, I made a hat and tights just so I could show up at the event with way more than she thought I could accomplish in 2 days. And I originally expected that fighting in the hat was going to be a disastrous idea. I wore it to fighter practice to test it out. I'm like, this is going to be, everyone is going to murder me because I'm wearing this 22-inch diameter circle tied to my fencing mask. And it turns out that if anyone has blinded me by hitting my hat, I know exactly where their sword is, which means I know exactly where their sword isn't, and I can just cut off their legs and it's fine. It actually turned out not to be a detriment at all, and a lot of people miss me with headshots because of hats. It's great. But if you are doing a hat, which I highly recommend, because if you're going to go to the effort to make a really cool period-looking kit, you really ought to find a way to really tie it all together. And it's really not difficult to make a fighting hat. The hat that I usually fight in is not necessarily historically accurately constructed, but one of the things that I thought about is I'm going to get hit in the head repeatedly while wearing this. What can I do to make that still look like a hat after a day of fighting? The best thing to make a giant hat brim out of, if you need to make a giant one or even a smaller one, those stainless steel wires that come in the collapsible laundry hampers you can get at the dollar store, if you sew those in around the edge of your hat binding, they will last for years. Believe me, I know. I think we're going on 8 years that hat has been hit with a sword pretty regularly, and I have never had a problem with it. Occasionally, I will get a kink in the wire, and I just have to bend it straight out again, but it gets hit and it bounces right back. So keeping in mind some weird non-traditional materials for making your hats may be important if you're doing something that has any body to it. I know other people who fought in more like compact hats that don't need that sort of structure, but I'm, when in doubt, overdress. I'm all about doing it big. So that's really all I have. I am going to post these things in the chat so you don't have to worry about writing them down and spelling them correctly, because I would far rather, I prepared everything so I can just copy and paste this. It's great.
Very cool. So somebody wants to know what kind of closures you recommend.
It really depends on what your priorities are. When I finished my first gambeson, I put a bunch of buttons down the front of it. And that's really tedious. Lots of buttons is lots of time. And when you've been fighting all day and your fingers are hot and sweaty and sometimes swollen, it's real hard to undo all those buttons. And of course, I spent weeks working on this gambeson. And the first time I brought it to fighter practice, when the fighters looked at it, it was like, oh, that's really cool. It'd be better if you used a Norse zipper on it. I'm like, what the heck is a Norse zipper? So I looked that up. Norse zipper is kind of the standard that my household uses because they definitely prioritize comfort and durability over being 100% historically accurate. If you too are like, I want something that will not fall apart ever and is super easy to take off, Norse zippers are great. They are not period, we think. They are plausibly period. They use technology that existed at the time in a way we've never actually seen in any extant garment or illustrations. Like there's no evidence this was ever done. So I'm not advocating that it's period, but it is really practical because what it is you take a piece of cording and you run it down your seam and make a loop and run it down the seam and make a loop. And you do this on both sides all the way down and they're staggered. And then you put each loop through the loop before it all the way down. And then you close it with a button at the bottom or the top if you'd rather. I like the button at the bottom so it's not under the crochet. And then when you're done with fighting for the day, you undo that one button and rip open your garment and you're free. It's very startling for the people next to you, especially if they don't know you, especially if you're the only girl on the field. But it will last through the wash after wash after wash after wash. You're never like, you will eventually have to replace the button at the bottom, but one button that might fail is it. Super practical, but they are kind of visible and they are not the most period thing. I have seen people use point ties to tie things together. I've seen people use lacing, larger, better, like, wider spaced buttons. For me, it's all about the aesthetic. It's all about trying to find what looks best with what I am trying to accomplish. So when I take apart and rebuild my Waffenrock, which desperately needs to happen, I am planning on doing the majority of that with the visible parts are going to be done with point ties, but the part underneath that you can't see, I'm probably going to stick with a Norse zipper because it's easy, it's practical, it's not something that's going to wear out in the wash. It's really low profile. If I get hit on it, I cannot feel it because it's just cording. There's nothing rigid in there at all. And at some point, I'm going to actually like write up an instructional handout on how to do the Norse zipper with a little print this out yourself template, because trying to figure out the exact spacing to get that to work is a pain. So I actually have a little armor scrap, a little piece of metal that is my Norse zipper template that has the exact wrap length for the loop and the exact spacing length between loops. So you just go down your sewing machine and you sew it until you get to the little tick mark, and then you wrap the cord around it, and then you zigzag back and forth, and then you keep going down the cording until you get to the next tick mark and wrap it around. It's really easy to do, but that spacing, I probably went through 15 different tests before I got one that interlaced and laid flat.
I was gonna say, I think my sister just posted a tutorial on making one of those zippers, and I will link to it in the comments probably after we finish, because I don't want to spend time looking for it while I'm talking to you. But yeah, so yeah, so I mean, there is one out there, and your process sounds a little bit different than hers, but you know, all good.
Yeah, I mean, I love looking at the way other people have done things because you can learn so much from someone else's perspective. Honestly, I was told that a Norse zipper was like some interlocking loop thing, and I did research on, could not figure out how to do it. So I had to invent it myself based on the knowledge that it existed.
Yeah.
So
Versus
I
like,
probably do it differently than everybody else, which is great because that means that there's at least 2 different ways to do it, which means that anyone who wants to know how to make the thing will have options to choose from.
the other thing I was going to say is sometimes I'll fake buttons with hook and eye tape underneath, so because I get claustrophobic every once in a while and I have to get out of my stuff, and doing buttons is it takes way too long. So I love the hook and eye tape because it's invisible.
Yeah.
Yeah. And somebody else wanted to know, and I don't know the answer to this because I just fight rattan. Do you have any ideas on what they say, like the puncture resistant material besides linen or cotton, because it takes 3 layers? Do you have any other material you'd recommend that could help avoid heat issues?
I mean, for avoiding heat issues, honestly, linen is one of your better bets. I have been told by other marshals that the heaviest weight linen you can get at fabricstore.com, when after washed and shrunk, passes the punch test at a single layer.
Oh.
So I have yet to personally test that. So that is my caveat here, is I have not personally run the test on that, but I do trust the other marshals who told me this. So assuming that that is not just a fluke of the batch they got, that is awesome because it means you could just make like poofy shirt out of heavy linen and then make your doublet out of whatever you want. Or heck, just fight in a poofy shirt because we can document that was totally a thing. I've also found some I found a really obscure company that does a lot of hemp upholstery fabric that has some beautiful twills that I got a sample of one that they no longer carry. So I've only gotten the one that they don't have anymore. But I found a hemp linen blend that they had that also passed at 1 layer and was near indestructible. Like I cut a hole in it and tried to tear it and I couldn't. So I spent too long trying to debate what color I wanted and they discontinued the fabric while I was thinking about it. So I'm real sad about that. But I had intended to get some of that as well as to make a easier, more heat compatible fighting dress out of. Really what I recommend is if you get a punch test or can borrow a punch test from someone, by all means, borrow that punch test and go through your sewing room and punch all of your fabric. Test everything you've got scraps of, because once you played with that test for a little bit, you really get a sense of like, you can feel the fabric and be like, I'm pretty sure this will pass at 1 layer, or I think this will pass with a lightweight lining. And I'm usually pretty right about that. We built a punch test when I first started fighting. We didn't have a steel marshal in the area when I first started. So we were doing all of this like literally by the book. Like we downloaded the book and we're like, all right, we're gonna figure out how to do this thing. So as soon as we get a marshal to pay attention to us, we can fight. So we built our own punch test and I tested a bunch of different things trying to figure out what will work, because the recommendation in the book is really limited and really vague. And it doesn't give you a whole lot of options. And that's because there's so much inconsistency in fabric. You cannot just say, you know, if you get 2 layers of this, it will reliably pass, because there's so many different manufacturing standards for fabrics. It's really, really difficult to say this will always pass. The best thing to really do is get familiar with what it feels like to punch things. And if you're going to any event that I am going to, you can always send me a message and say, hey, can you bring your punch test to this event so I can play with it? And I will bring the punch test to the event and you can test anything you want. I usually have a couple fabric scraps in the bag that you can play with and punch test things that I've already got. But the materials to build the punch test are really not that expensive as long as you take into account. So I don't know if the rules have been revised. At the time when we built ours, there was like only 1 or 2 approved companies you were able to get the pin that they use to try and punch the fabric. I don't really think that the pin is that particular. I do not agree with the fact that it has to be from one of these 2 companies. It's going to charge you $15 shipping for this $2 part. That's kind of ridiculous. Anything that is the right size and is made of metal should work. That said, you can go down to the hardware store, get the supplies to build yourself a punch test, probably $20 or less, and just have one. You can probably convince your local branch that you need one as a martial supply and get them to fund a punch test that you can build for your local branch to have, and just make it one of the martial equipments. You are the branch marshal, you get the punch test. That would be my recommendation, is get a punch test and play with it, because sometimes you would be surprised. We found a fabric that looked like some sort of upholstery blend that looked passably like wool we found in the clearance section at Joann's, and it passes at a single layer. The only reason we lined it is because the inside felt kind of gross. Some things you would be really surprised can pass at relatively lightweight layers. The fabric that I'm wearing now is I don't know if you can see the details on it, probably not. It's one of those that kind of looks embroidered, the kind of like puffy fabric. I've forgotten the name for it. This passes at a single layer. So I could fence in this doublet, except for the fact that I didn't want to go through the effort of fitting the sleeves because I made this in a hurry when I was supposed to be working on something else.
Right, and one more question. When you started, if you knew then what you know now, what big thing would you do differently?
Oh gosh, I would have not avoided cartridge pleating my Waffen Rock. Maybe that doesn't sound like a big thing to anybody else, but I spent so much time trying to sew in knife pleats because it was what I was comfortable with a garment where the skirt circumference is 6 times my waist circumference.
That's a lot of pleats.
And I broke needles, and it was just a nightmare. And if I had cartridge pleated it, it would look better, it would wear better, it would have been easier. Like so many things. There's so many things that I avoided because I thought they were scary that ended up just taking me a lot more time. But I would say that the big things would be things like not being afraid of cartridge pleating, and really taking the time to figure out padding better, because I'm still really sad that my first gambeson stopped fitting. I mean, it's not nearly flashy enough for me to wear now, but I am still just really sad that that I didn't even get a year out of it. It was very disappointing how little time I had with that before I couldn't wear it. But I would say that those are the easy things. The other things are like all of the things that I did in this presentation. Almost everything that I talked about today is with the exception of like the first 2 pages of my presentation, everything else is something that I learned since I started fighting. So every single piece of fighting garb I have has something wrong with it that caused me to learn the things I talked to you about today. I don't have anything that I have made to fight in that I didn't learn something valuable from. I like learning from things, and I like people to be able to learn from my mistakes. I mean, if I've already bothered to make the mistakes, why shouldn't everyone learn from the things I screwed up? Definitely. So that is the big thing, like adding extra ease to your shoulder and elbow. Such a world of difference, because I only wear that beautiful orange dress that has $70 worth of trim on it. I only wear it at events where I want to look really cool, and I am not at all confident I'm going to win. Like I'm not a very good rapier fighter. I'm a cut and thrust fighter. I'm decent at cut and thrust. I'm not a good rapier fighter. We have a lot more high-profile rapier tournaments than we do cut and thrust tournaments, and I know I'm not going to win them. So I just go with like, whatever, I'm just going to look awesome while I'm being everybody's easy win. It's great. So I wear that for things like that. I wear it to fight in like QRC, because I am never going to win the Queen's Rapier Championship. It is just not going to happen. But I want to look fabulous because it's QRC. So I wear it for things like that. Because it restricts my movement, I'm not as functional in that because I didn't do the shoulders right. I would never wear that for an important cut and thrust tournament at least not before I take it apart and rebuild it better, because it gets in my way because I didn't do the shoulders right. I didn't do the elbows right. I don't have enough reach in it. So for me, the big things are figuring out how to incorporate the extra mobility you need without ruining the aesthetic. Because my background prior to joining the SCA and prior to getting the job that I have, my background is in theater. So I can make anything look like anything. Like, doesn't matter what it's made out of, doesn't matter if it's made right, I can make it look great from 20 feet away. That is I have a degree in that. But getting something that's really day-to-day functional, gives you that mobility, is super, super tricky to learn. And there's not a lot of places to go to learn that. You really kind of have to learn from your own mistakes or someone else's.
That sort of folds into the question that we just got. Like, when an area of a pattern doesn't fit, is there a resource available to help you figure out what measurement needs to be changed?
Yes. I should have brought this over. If you will give me one moment, actually, in my Google Drive, there is something, I have something like a book review. I don't remember what I called it. It's something like book review. Yes, book review. In my book review document, I need to update it because it's been a while. But one of the things that's in there is this absolutely fantastic book called Fitting and Pattern Alteration. It is a modern book. It is mostly focused on women's garments, but it goes through body section by body section where the thing doesn't fit right, what that looks like in terms of drag lines, and 3 different ways to alter your pattern to compensate for that issue. And it has things like broad shoulders, slumped shoulders, narrow shoulders. Like, it will go through all of the different things that can be weird about your body and how to compensate for that from a standard off the rack pattern to fit whatever issue that is. And it goes through shoulders, it goes through waist, it goes through arms, like everything on your body. It is a phenomenal resource. I have an older edition because when I was looking for this book, it like the newest edition was like $60 and the oldest edition was like 35. I don't honestly know what the difference is between the newer version and the older version. I haven't found anything that I find terribly disagreeable in the older version. So I don't know I'm pretty sure it's used as a textbook is the reason there's so many editions of it. You know how they love to make textbooks more expensive and come out with new ones every couple of years, so you can't just use the one that already existed. But that would be my recommendation if you want to learn more about fitting and pattern resources. That book is phenomenal as a teaching tool.
Can you just repeat the title?
Fitting and Pattern Alteration.
And it's on her Google Drive. She has an amazing resource there where she's critiqued all the books that she's read, and she tells you the ones that she thinks are the best. So I've been there. She has amazing resources. You should check it out. I put her link in the comments. So
yeah, that is one of the books that I would highly recommend to anyone who just like anyone like me who has a theatrical background. Like, I can make something look like whatever I want. I just need it to fit and function better. That is a really great take it to the next level book. I highly recommend it. Again, I don't think it matters what edition you get. You can probably get an older one. But I have mine, I've got little post-it flags for every body section on mine. So I've got one on the shoulders section and one on the hip section and one on the waist section. So whatever I'm doing, I can just flip to that section and be like, narrow shoulders, broad shoulders, slumped shoulders. Here we are. This is what we need. But it's a really, really useful book. And if anyone if anyone wants to become a super intense pattern geek, the program that I use at work, the 3D one that I mentioned earlier, is relatively affordable as high-tech computer patterns go, patterning software goes, and they do a 30-day free trial. And they've got really good instructional videos on how to use the thing. It is really, really, really great resource. and it's called CLO 3D, so CLO. And their tech support team is awesome, and the program is, if you know Adobe Illustrator, the learning curve isn't so steep. It's got a lot of Illustrator isms. I did not have an Illustrator background before I started learning that program. I've learned Illustrator since and have definitely could see the similarities. But it's a really, really great program for testing how things fit and how you can modify patterns. Because again, you can take your two-dimensional pattern is on one side of your screen and your 3D is on the other side, and you can change that shoulder angle and hit render, and it will change the shoulder angle, and you will see that happening on the avatar. And it's a really great way of seeing how things move. And you can also take your avatar and go into their measurement and tinker with them to an extent to build custom measurements. You can take that avatar and make their shoulders broader if your shoulders are broader, and you can make them shorter waisted if you need them to be more shaped like you, to try and see how that works. But it's a really, really great resource. It's not the most affordable thing in the world. It's a lot more affordable than a lot of other patterning software. But it's still not the cheapest thing in the world. But the 30-day free trial is totally worth playing with. I definitely have decided that even if I stop having the job that I have, I'm keeping that program. Like, I will pay for it to have it myself because it is just so useful.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, I don't see any more questions. So I want to thank you again. This has been super informative. And I took your articulating seam joint, whatever it was, the class before, and I having the refresher is really cool. So I'm gonna have to give that a try. It's
seam articulation is one of my favorite things. It's such an underutilized thing that has been around for hundreds of years. But
well,
I'm
go ahead.
I was gonna say I'm glad I could help, and I always just feel like I'm just like chattering and geeking about this, but I'm like I love patterns. It's kind of what I do. So if anybody, I put in the chat where to find me if anyone needs to send me a message on Facebook. I'm like, I don't understand how you do this. It may take me a bit to get back to you message wise, but I am always up for questions, or like I've had people out of the blue send me fitting photos. Like, I tried on my mock-up and it's doing this weird thing. How do I fix it? Totally up for that. It may take me a bit to get back to you because I'm not online all the time, but I'm happy to answer questions if anyone has them, because I always feel like I'm shoving the last 20 years of my pattern knowledge into an hour and a half presentation. I'll be like, I wouldn't absorb it this quickly.
Well, I think your PowerPoints and your drawings are very, very helpful. So I appreciate that you put it all in on the Google Drive and that people can take a look at it. So thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Next week I'm going to have on Alistair from Blathanor, I think, or Glamir, and he's going to teach us about tent painting. So that should be fun too. So thank you so much, Taran, and I hope September Crown happens so we can watch you get elevated. Very well deserved, and we look forward to it. So
should be a ridiculous spectacle. I've got things planned.
Excellent, excellent. All right. Thanks everyone, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.